Okay, so it's been a little while since the last top 10, but I figured that now would be a good time to do it. And this is back in the vanilla version of Third Age, it's worth mentioning, because the vanilla version is honestly better balanced for multiplayer. It seems like the vast majority of the submods like Divide and Conquer and Moss are both more designed with single player in mind rather than multiplayer, and I'm speaking more from a multiplayer standpoint when I'm making these lists and these overviews. So we're back in vanilla, and we will be doing the top 10 heavy cav units within the game. So I'll set off at number 10. Okay, so coming in at number 10, we have the Dale Earls. Now, in terms of style, these guys naturally look very, very good. I've always been a big fan of Dale's units. But what about the stats? Now, the stats for the Earls are kind of strange, actually, for a heavy cav unit in this game. For the most part, they are shock cavalry. But in the case of the Earls, this is not the case, because their stats are as follows. The attack is 9, the defense is 17, and the charge is 5. Now, they can't form Wedge, but Wedge is pretty rare in Third Age. I think there are only 3 units that can actually form Wedge. This is not one of them. They cost 980 each, and just like the standard Earls, they're not very massable. It's very difficult to get a lot of Earls on the field, which does count against them. But the reason why this is so different to most other cav units is most other cav units prioritise the charge rather than the attack and the defense scores. And honestly, this is something which I prefer, because your cav should be doing most of its damage off the charge. But the Dale Earls are actually possibly the best cav unit. If your micro isn't very good, the Earls will not punish you as much for leaving them in melee, because they will last a pretty long time against the vast majority of units, as long as they're not pikes or spears, because they will still take a lot of damage to them. Nonetheless, they are at number 10 because a charge bonus is really very, very important when it comes to heavy cav, and Dale's Earls don't have a very high charge bonus. The 8th Wodia of Dale do have a higher charge bonus, but their other stats are lagging behind a little bit in terms of what the really high tier is up to. So, in my opinion, the Earls are still Dale's best cav unit. They're pretty ideal as the General's Bodyguard unit because of how survivable they are, but they do have the lower charge, which is a bit of a weakness. Let's just see how well they deal with some very low tier goblins. This is not going to be pretty for them in any situation. I've also turned up the settings, which is nice. Usually in multiplayer it will crash if the settings are too high when I'm playing with my friends. Still a very deadly charge. Obviously this is a very low tier unit, so you know the impact was felt very keenly. Leaving them in melee is much more acceptable though. The Earls will not fold when they're in sustained melee, especially not against this sort of unit, but this is really the main strength of the Earls. Aside from their looks, of course. But yeah, against a heavier infantry, that kind of devastation would not have happened. Against something like high-tier dwarves, for example, the low charge would certainly have had more of an effect. And then in the sustained melee, while they would be pretty good, they're still going to lose out, which is really the problem. The sustained melee advantage that they have only really comes into effect against units which are going to beat them in sustained melee anyway. Nonetheless, the Earls are still a very deadly cav unit, so the enemy are nearly all dead. Their general's still not dead though, which is why they haven't broken. Surprised they haven't broken actually. Where is the enemy general? Must be over here, surely. There he is. Okay, so that was the Earls at number 10, and now we'll go on to number 9. So coming in at number 9, we have the mounted battle-ready Dunedain of Eriador. Now, this is a unit which is really down this low on the list due to one reason, and I will get to that, but we'll talk about the good things first. The stats, for example, 7 attack, 16 defense, and 9 charge. Now you'll notice that the attack and defense stats significantly lower than the Earl's stats, but the charge is much more like it. 9 is honestly the median for the high tier heavy cav in terms of charge, so the mounted battle ready Dunedain are at least on par with most of the other heavy cav units in the game. There are only a few which are higher than that. They can also form Wedge, which is nice. Wedge, honestly, I think that Wedge's use is limited, but it's nice to have the utility nonetheless, and it is something that they have over most of the other heavy cav units. So why are they down in 9th? Well, really the reason is they only have 62 men in the unit. Well, 61 if you don't have the general in there. And that's a problem, because if you start to lose unit models, the charge will become significantly less effective as the unit models will drop. Also, they're not the cheapest cav unit in the world. 980 is honestly quite a lot for a cav unit from Eriador. Although I do have to admit that Eriador will be able to afford more of their more expensive units, because a lot of their main line is quite cheap and affordable. If you're playing as Eriador, you're going to want these guys because they will give you a lot of muscle in the cav engagements, and you'll be able to shred through infantry with these guys. Even if they're protecting their archers, you can use Wedge to get through them. It's just that they don't have enough men in the unit, which is honestly the problem with quite a lot of the units that I've been mentioning throughout these top 10s. Nonetheless, this charge should be pretty nasty indeed. Also, these guys look awesome as well. I love the spears, I love the shields, I like the battle-ready Dunedain looks in general. I kind of like the fact that they're not clad in heavy plate. Yeah, a lot of damage done there. More damage off the charge done there. At least a little bit more than the Earls. The problem is, of course, they are not as good in sustained melee. So I will get them out there. They probably would still win in sustained melee against something like Goblin Infantry, but it's not something you really want to be doing. I love cav charges. One of my more favourite types of unit in the game, heavy cavalry. And there we go. So a very deadly cav unit. Again, the problem for me really is that there's not enough men in the unit. They can be focused out by stuff like crossbows a little bit more easily as a result of having a few less men in the unit. And unlike some of the very high tier cav, which, you know, we'll get to when we get there, they don't really make up for it with very, very good stats, in my opinion. They just have kind of the average stats for this list with a few less men, but with Wedge. So, yeah, as Eriador, you're going to be using these guys extensively, but they will lose out in some cav engagements just by virtue of having less men in their unit. So coming in at number 8, we have Rune's Loka Inas Rim. And of all of Rune's pretty diverse cavalry roster, this unit is the best. Its stats, in terms of its stats though, 7 attack, 15 defense and 9 charge. That's 1 less defense than the mounted battle-ready Dunedain. Of course the difference is there are more of these guys, so they are, in my opinion, the more units outweighs the fact that they have 1 less defense. They're heavily armored enough as well that it doesn't really make much of a difference. 1 is not a tragic difference. The reason why they're not higher up on the list though, because this sort of unit size and, you know, these sorts of statistics are the sort of thing which most of the list is made up of. The reason why they're not higher though is they are very, very expensive. There is only one other unit on this list which is more expensive than these guys. They cost 1,250. Which is only, I've said like it's only one other unit is more expensive than that, and that's a unit which is kind of different anyway. These guys don't really offer anything different to most other heavy cav units, and for a significant amount more, it's not really worth it when you look at it like that. Especially when you think that Rune already suffer from having an army that's too expensive to compete with some of the higher tier factions. And that's a real shame, because I think if the Inas Rim were like 1,000, it would become a mainstay of any army, but as it is, it's too expensive. You can mass them up. Like, I think you can get 3 before the cost increases. You can at least have 2 though, which is an improvement over some of the other heavy cav on this list, of which you can only have one before the cost increases. Nonetheless, the cost is what prevents them from going any higher, but the amount of units is what prevents them from going any lower. So once again, let's have them charge into the goblins. Also, if it were a style contest, only one unit, in my opinion, looks nicer than the Innis Rim. They are a stunning looking unit. Some people might think the gold is a little bit flashy, but I like it. I like the look of Rune in general. Okay, here we go. Lance is down.
Only battle appears to be running in our favor. From good
Can't even see them anymore.
does victory spring forth.
Yeah, you see also that the amount of units does also affect the charge, because I had a wider charge, which meant I killed more on impact than the Earls were able to. No, not the Earls, the Mounted Battle Ready Dunedain, which means despite having one less defense and not having wedge, all of the positives outweigh that in my opinion. So now we'll move on to number 7. So coming in at number 7, we have really the only orc or orc faction unit which can be considered good heavy cavalry, and that is the Black Nmenreans. Now these guys work off the same principle as the Dale Earls in the sense that they have a lower charge than the majority of cavalry on this list at only 6, still more than the Earls but significantly lower than everything else. But their stats in melee are really very, very good. 11 attack and 18 defense outclasses everything else. Well, the Elves have got slightly higher attack, but the very high defense means individually they're very difficult to kill. Of course, there aren't very many of them, only 37, which is low, and I did penalise the Mounted Battle Ready Dunedain for such a thing. And the thing that I penalised the Loke Innis Rim for, of course, was being very expensive, and this was the unit that is more expensive than them. They cost 1,500. That is a pretty ridiculous amount, especially playing as Mordor when you perhaps want to invest in something like Olag High or Trolls of some description. However, these guys do have something about them which makes them better than the units before them in my opinion. One is the fact that they give Mordor a sense of movement that isn't just limited to the Trolls, which means that Mordor become a better faction for having these guys. There is also the fact that they cause fear, and they're the only cavalry unit on this list that causes fear, which means when it comes to rear charging infantry which is engaged, these guys are the best at breaking them. So if you're able to worm your cavalry behind the enemy lines, you will be able to wreak havoc, especially if you're facing a faction like another orc faction whose morale is low. The problem, of course, is that they are a small unit, so they will suffer when it comes to being mobbed by other cavalry. They are slightly better against spears, I've noticed as well. These guys technically count as heavy infantry, I believe, in addition to being cavalry. It's kind of weird, but nonetheless, they are the most different unit on this list. Most of them, apart from the Earls and these guys, will focus on the same thing of having very high charge, wiping out the enemy as quickly as possible. These guys, they will run on their fear. If you can rear charge enemy units, the problem of course with this is you're only likely to have one cav unit because you're not going to be able to afford more, so the enemy will be able to zone you out pretty easily. But it's the possibility of being able to rout your entire enemy's line very quickly. And of course it's pretty much the ideal general's bodyguard unit. So, let's see, shall we? Sadly in vanilla, no dismounted version of the Black Nmenreans. Of course not shock cavalry, so they'll just go in with their swords. This is not going to end well for the goblins though. 18 defense is not something I think they're going to be able to get through very easily. Again though, not a huge drop in numbers, but when looking at how good the heavy cavalry is, I need to think about what it adds to the faction. And what Mordor needed more than anything else really was a bit of mobility that wasn't just their trolls. And the Black Nmenreans certainly provide that. I've been on the receiving end of Black Nmenreans in the past when they've been used right, and they can be devastating. Very tough to kill as well. In sustained melee, they will last a surprising amount of time. Obviously, in this sort of situation, it's a little bit different. There goes the enemy general. And there we go. So the general dying and the fear by the Black Nmenreans will break enemy units very nicely. So yeah, you know, the Black Nmenreans, perhaps they don't deserve to be quite this high due to the same reasons as the mounted battle-ready Dunedain, but I think that if you use them correctly, they can win you the battle on their own. Of course, you know, this depends on your skill level. It's not a skill level that I possess, certainly, but it is something that I've been on the receiving end of, so I've seen it done, therefore they are up this high. So moving on now to number 6. So, number 6 we have Harad's Serpent Guard. Now, from here on in, all of the units will be based upon the same thing. High charge, and that's pretty much the centerpiece of what they're all about. Most of them as well will have this sort of level of units. 2 have less, but 76 is what the Serpent Guard will ride into battle with. Their stats: 7 attack, 16 defense, and 9 charge. That's essentially the same as the Innis Rim, only with 1 more defense, and they're also significantly cheaper. They are 1,000 per unit, which, that's good value for money. Very good value for money, in fact, because I believe they are the, actually no, the unit that's just in front of them is slightly better value for money, but the Serpent Guard, very, very good value for money. Similar to all of Harad's faction, really. You can have quite a lot of these guys before the price increases, so, you know, you're going to be able to overwhelm with your superior quality cav over the enemy, because chances are a lot of the high tier factions have to compromise on their quality somewhere. As Harad, you don't often have to do that. I've ridden into battle before with 4 Serpent Guard quite comfortably in my army, being able to afford them even some upgrades, whereas the enemy have to cut down on the amount of heavy cav they have. The Serpent Guard do suffer a little bit when it comes to their stats against some of the higher tier units, it must be said, but there's no doubting the fact that Harad's value for money does put them in contention. At least you can fight against other factions, and in the cav battle, if you can have more Serpent Guard than the enemy has, for instance, Swan Knights, you've put yourself in a good position to win the cav fight, and then Harad can really press home their advantage. So let's see how they do, shall we? This should be pretty nasty. This should be similar to the Innis Rim, honestly. And from here on out, that's the sort of thing you'll be seeing, where they just sort of get mown down. Serpent Guard are cool looking as well. As I've said before, I've got a real soft spot for Harad. Even discounting the Muma kill. Yeah, that is nasty. An enormous amount of losses they took right off the bat there, down into the 30s from 250. They didn't break instantly like I did with the Innis Rim, but again, that's mainly down to chance. Horns made of clay! And there they go. So yeah, the Serpent Guard, very, very solid cav unit, very, very affordable. The only thing that stops it from getting higher, in my opinion, is that the quality does start to shine through at the very high level, as with the other 2 top 10 lists, but there's no doubt in the value for money, and you can pull off some very impressive victories with Harad, with the Serpent Guard mounted and dismounted at its centre. Coming in at number 5, we have the Arnor Knights. Nice heavy plate, nice shields, nice lances. These guys are slightly cheaper than the Serpent Guard that preceded them at 950, and these guys are the sort of second tier Arnor cav, so that should give you an idea of what's to come. The stats are 7 attack, 17 defense, and 9 charge, so essentially they are a little bit better than the Serpent Guard in terms of defense, and they're cheaper, and that's what makes them slightly better. They also have 1 more per unit, so you know, basically just slightly better than the Serpent Guard in every way. Having said that, Arnor are really the heavy cav faction of this game. They really do own the cav engagement, so it's no surprise to see that Arnor units will be up there, up in the top 5. I will say that when it comes to fielding these guys, I think you can only have 2 before the price increases. Yes, you can only have 2 before the price increases, which means you will have to compromise somewhere in your army if you want to have the full complement of Arnor Knights. Nonetheless, very cheap for what they offer you. You know, the 9 charge and the 17 defense, they're going to be very difficult to deal with. So let's just get right on with it. Awesome looking units as well, Arnor. Perfect for mowing down goblins. I don't really have anything bad to say about them, to be honest, because they're good value for money, they've got excellent stats, they fit their faction almost perfectly. It's going to be pretty much instantaneous down into the 30s again, I imagine. Yeah, slightly better charge than the Serpent Guard got. But yeah, the reason why they're not higher, similar to Serpent Guard really, the stats of the units above them, the quality really starts to shine through. But, you know, nonetheless, they are still up in the top 5, and if you're in the top 5 of any of these lists, it means you are high quality indeed. So we'll move on to number 4 and see what was able to beat the Arnor Knights. Coming in at number 4, we have the one and only Elven unit on this list, so they will not be occupying the top 2 slots on this one, the Nmenreans Lancers. They have the same amount of men in their unit as the mounted battle-ready Dunedain of Eriador, yet they are significantly higher on the list. It's not due to their cost, they're slightly more, in the sense that they're 1,060 florins, but their stats are where, obviously, the Elven units will start to do their damage. 8 attack, 18 defense, and 9 charge. That puts their stats around the same sort of level as the Black Nmenreans, honestly. The attack is slightly lower and the charge is slightly higher, which for Cav in my opinion is better. Of course they don't cause fear. The problem again is why they're not higher is, well, there's 2 reasons really. One, the units that are higher than them all have better charge than 9. And 2, obviously less men in the unit. They, however, offer the High Elves an option which the Sylvan Elves do not have. Sylvan Elves don't really have melee cav at all. Whereas the Nmenreans Lancers are an exceptional heavy cav unit, which means the High Elves again have got more options. Now of course, with the Elves you're going to struggle to field anything in large numbers. It means you're going to have to compromise immensely in areas such as your infantry if you're going to field a full complement of Nmenreans Lancers and Newman Cavalry. Nonetheless, they give the Elves an excellent option, which the Sylvan Elves do not have, the High Elves I should say. So, let's see how well these guys do when they charge into a mass of goblins. I'm honestly not expecting the initial damage to be as much as the units with more in them. But the stats on these guys are just so impressive that I had to put them above the Serpent Guard and the Arnor Knights and the Innis Rim. There's also the fact that they just give the Elves an option they so sorely needed. One of the things you'll really miss the Sylvan Elves is having this maneuverability and punch. Let's see how much it will take them down to. About into the 60s. Okay. We've taken a few losses, but this is... oh, they broke already. Well, I didn't even get the chance to do another charge, but that demonstrates how much damage the Elves can do with their cavalry. Of course, you're going to need to sacrifice your army in other places if you're going to bring Nmenreans Lancers, but they are very, very good, of course. The Elves' quality will always shine through at the top of these lists, and the Elves have a presence here as well. So, into the top 3, and we enter it with the Rohirrim in the Royal Guard. In terms of stats, these guys are basically Serpent Guard with better charge. They have 7 attack, 16 defense, and 10 charge. A little bit more expensive than the Serpent Guard at 1,120, but you can have just as many before the price increases. So they're basically similar units, only with about 100 florins different, and these guys, of course, slightly better quality. And as Rohan, you need to leverage your cav, because your infantry is not really up to much when it comes to taking on some of the higher tier factions. So you're going to need to use your cavalry, and these guys are the best you have available. 10 charge as well. Only 2 other units in the game can boast a charge score as good as that, and of course they're the 2 units that are above them due to various reasons. So let's see how the Royal Guard do. Pretty good value for money as well, honestly. 1,120. When you're the Rohirrim, your cavalry is where you want to be spending your money, not saving your money. So here we go. The 10 charge, of course they have more men in the unit than the Nmenreans Lancers, so they will be able to get their charge bonus off more efficiently. And that is...
the enemy of battle seems to be swinging in our favour. From such tidings does victory emerge.
Can't see them. Down into the 20s off the initial charge. So that's what the extra charge will give you. Of course, you're never really going to have a charge like that in a multiplayer situation. But nonetheless, 10 charge is something that you can't really ignore. And that's what gets them a spot in the top 3. So now, moving on to the units that manage to place above them. So coming in at number 2, and a personal favourite of mine, we have the Swan Knights. Even I couldn't justify putting them above the one that finished at number 1 though, so even with my bias I couldn't put the Swan Knights higher. But the stats, you know, the reason they're above the Royal Guard is they have 7 attack, which is the same admittedly, but they have 18 defence, which is one of the reasons they're above them. They have the same charge at 10. 10 is the highest charge that you'll get off a heavy cav unit. They can form wedge though, which is nice. Bit of extra utility. They cost a little bit more at 1,200, but it's that extra defense, the ability to form wedge, that will really make it so that they will place higher than the Royal Guard. Get my words out. Also, the fact that these guys look amazing. Like Gondor, again, my favourite faction, and the Swan Knights play a big role in that. They're awesome. But yeah, just the extra defense really does help you out. It's the same level of defense as the Elder Endway Lancers and the Black Nmenreans, and you have the 10 charge, and you have the wedge. All of these things combine together to make the Swan Knights an excellent cav unit. Only one cav unit can boast being better, and it's pretty clear why when we get there. But we will now charge into the Goblin Infantry. Here they come. So I would imagine this is going to go pretty similar to the way the Royal Guard one went, take them down to the 20s and then they'll break immediately. And goodbye.
The battle seems to be swinging in our favour. From such tidings does
down into the 20s. Just about. And there they go. So that's what the Swan Knights are all about. You'll often see the Swan Knights used as a sort of offensive option in sieges, and why not? You know, they'll be able to survive the initial arrow fire and then they can wreak havoc in the enemy's lines. Of course, watch out for trolls though. So now moving on to the best heavy cav unit in the game. And of course, there was only one answer for the best heavy cav unit in 3rd Age, and that is the Knights of Newman. In terms of stats, they really make a mockery of everyone else's stats. They have 8 attack, 22 defense, and 10 charge. The only stat that any other cav unit has that's better than these guys is the Earls in sustained melee have got 1 more attack. But of course, in every other way, the Knights of Newman just wreck them. They can also form wedge, again, nice bit of utility. They only have 62 men in the unit, but usually you'll have 63 because your general is likely to be in a Knights of the Numinous unit. They only cost 1100 though, and I say only, that's quite a lot, but that's less than the Swan Knights, that's less than the Innis Rim, that's less than the Eldar Lancers, less even than the Royal Guard. Now, you can only have one before the price increases, but the power these guys give you on the battlefield in terms of the charge, the defense, everything, is just too great to ignore. They also look amazing, of course. These guys, really the poster child for Arnor as a faction, and what a front line that is. When against Arnor, if you see these guys running around, it's always a nightmare, because they won't drop from arrows because their defense is so high, and you know they're just going to charge in and just eviscerate a unit at some point when you're not looking. The micro game is real, and here we go.
Only the battle seems to be swinging in our favour. From such tidings does victory emerge.
They probably won't. Well, they're wavering, so yeah, they probably will. Yeah, they're only shaken. And here go the goblins. Now they're wavering again. Just take a moment to appreciate the armour of the mounted Dunedain Knights. So difficult to kill, of course. And there we go. So yeah, the Knights of Newman take the #1 spot, just followed by the Swan Knights and the Royal Guard in the top 3. And that is the best heavy cav that 3rd Age has to offer, and I will start doing these top 10s again, because I do enjoy doing them. But what to do next? I might do horse skirmishes next. I don't know. Heavy infantry is something that I obviously will do, but I'm putting it off because the amount of testing needed to actually do it comprehensively is rather large, and time is an issue there, of course. But I will be doing another top 10, hopefully within the week.